Good, thanks. Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. Record of attendance, Linda, you're good? Declarations of conflict of interest, anyone? And approval of the agenda, and the only item we have is Englobe.
So moved, Your Worship.
Moved by Councillor Mooney, second by Councillor Dawes. All those in favor? Aye. Contrary? Motion carried. Okay, good. So welcome to everybody here, lots of people. So what we have right now from this time until we have a council meeting at 7:30, but we'll see how long this goes. We have Evan Cole and Andrew Higgins. They're both from Englobe. They're the experts in the field, and what Evan is here to do is to present, provide a brief summary of findings of the report, the Englobe report that they have that they've put together on our behalf. So what will happen basically is Evan will present the findings. She has PowerPoint and everything. It makes it easier, and then we'll have questions and answers, and we can cover that after. But basically, one person at a time can come up, state your name, and right up to this table and ask the questions, one question at a time, so that she can answer each question. And we're just going to ask respectfully if we can wait until she is finished presenting, and then we can ask the questions after that. Good to go? Oh, okay, go ahead. You can figure that out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pam. Thank you, councillors. Most of you know me. My name is Evan Cole. I've been out working at the site since February 2016. So we're doing some water testing, some soil testing at the property. As a result of our February 2016 water sampling program, we developed an intrusive investigation to look at some of the other matters that fell out of that February investigation. I'm going to apologize. Try not to go too fast. So we designed an investigative program based on the history of the sawmill site. We were concerned about some chemical use on the property, and we wanted to get a better idea of exactly what was there and what was happening and where potentially it was migrating to, including all of the potable wells around the neighborhood. So our program consisted of 40 test pits. We drilled 14 boreholes. We installed monitor wells in all of those boreholes. We established 13 surface water sampling locations, including 5 piezometers that we put in some of the wetlands around the site. We delineated the wetlands. We mapped surface water flows in the area that we were looking at, and we sampled 11 of the potable water supplies in the area. We had a fairly heavy analytical program. So, you know, we were concerned about wood preservatives, other type of chemical use on that site, and we designed our analytical package around those chemicals. So mostly metals-based chemicals. We were also concerned about potential phenol treatment. We were concerned about creosote treatment. So we had those in our sampling package. We looked at PAHs, which are materials from burnt products from ash. And because we saw a little bit of isolated diesel oil, we ran 1 petroleum sample in the soil. Most of the water sampling was the same analytical package, the metals and the general chemistry, the phenols and the creosotes. Sediment, surface water, we carried on with those. And in the potable water sampling, we looked at general chemistry and metals and phenols. 2 locations we looked at coliforms. Now this is going to, there we go. So we got a lot of data. We didn't really find a lot of problems. For the soil that we looked at, the guidelines we chose for the property were the agricultural guidelines, which are the most stringent of the 4 guideline packages that we could look at. So they're more stringent than the residential ones. We also put residential guidelines in our data tables so that we could look at the effect of all of the neighboring properties along the Lake George Road. So in the soil, we really didn't find much. There were 3 locations that we had problems. So though I know the plan, is really busy and most of you can't see it. I can tell you the green polygons are wetlands that we delineated. Some of the black dots and squares, they are the test pit and the monitor well locations, surface water locations, and potable well locations. So the 3 red dots are the only 3 locations where we found soil that exceeded a guideline. Some of that soil exceeded both the residential and agricultural guidelines. Some of them only exceeded the residential guidelines. Those 3 parameters we saw were arsenic, vanadium, and selenium. So, in the groundwater, you remember we installed those 14 monitor wells. We tested all of those monitor wells and we looked at the shallow and the deep water. Again, we didn't really find all that much on the site. Those 2 locations had arsenic that was over the guideline. We had cobalt in a lot of the groundwater at the site, but upon further investigation of cobalt, the guideline that is presented is protective of surface water quality. It's not actually protective of drinking water quality. We empirically tested all the surface water and we didn't see cobalt in it. So we felt the cobalt at the site wasn't really an issue. In the surface water, this is where we found most of the items of concern. So the site's really big. It's at the top of a hill, the very top of a sub-watershed. Water drains off it in a couple different directions. Up at the north end, that red polygon that just popped up, that was much more visible on my laptop. Water on that portion of the site in that polygon drains to the north, and you'll see 2 arrows that go to the east and the west. That's the surface water flow pattern up in that area of the site. That would be easier. So, in that area of the site, a blue polygon just popped up. There is a high ridge of land right there that is directing all of the surface water to the north. So those houses that are right along the Lake George Road in that area, they're not actually receiving any surface water flow from the sawmill site. It's all running along that ridge and down, and it crosses a culvert. And I know the plan is really small. It's a function of trying to get a very large plan onto a slide so that everybody can at least see the location of some of the impacts. These plans are all in the reports. The reports are on the website. Feel free to go to those reports and take a look at the plans. So, the other half of the site, second polygon just appeared. Water in this area of the site comes down and it drains in a couple different directions. So all of that water draining towards Lake George Road ultimately crosses the road, and it's going to make its way down towards Killam Lake. We're not exactly sure at this time of what the flow patterns are because that was outside the scope of what we did in the March assessment. That one isolated spot up in the north of the site is the only place we saw water being directed the other way towards Lake George. So in the surface water, the pH was generally low. We saw a lot of different metals. There was no rhyme or reason what was high and what wasn't. But ultimately, they are all over an ecological guideline. So freshwater habitat, fish, bugs, frogs, the creatures that you would expect to see in waterways and wetlands. So these surface water guidelines, they are much more protective and they're much smaller than anything that's a human health guideline. There is only one house in this area that could be potentially impacted by the surface water, and we recognize that, and we've carried that one forward in our next phase of testing. So I mentioned we tested 11 potable water wells. In February, we had one house that had an elevated lead concentration, one house that the lead concentration was approaching the guideline. In our next round of sampling, we didn't see those results reproduced. Lead was non-detect. In the second round of sampling, we saw one drilled well that had elevated arsenic. So out of 2 complete rounds of potable water testing, we had elevations at 2 locations and 1 location that was approaching the guideline. That was it for bad water quality. We didn't see any phenol in any of the residential wells. There were a couple of locations that had trace detections of phenol, but it was several orders of magnitude below the guideline for phenol. So in summary, there is no evidence of widespread contamination at the Ibbotson site. We only had a handful of soil locations that were over a guideline. We only had a couple of groundwater locations that were over a guideline. There was no evidence that there had been phenol or creosote treatment of wood at the site. We tested the compost, and there was no evidence of chemical contamination in the compost. What we were left with was a few isolated metals in soil and groundwater, and the bulk of the impacts we saw were in the surface water. So, moving forward, we had some recommendations. At the site, we had very limited soil exceedances, and based on where the soil we found was, it was in no way accessible to anybody that was walking on the site. So it was in the deeper soil deposits. So what we have recommended is to verify that there's no human health exposure to these soils, and we probably will not remediate any of the soil at the site. Sediment, in the sediment we tested, we didn't find any contamination. We do have some additional sediment locations proposed in the next phase of work to help validate and assess the surface water quality. In the surface water, we found a lot of heavy metals, depressed pH. We've recommended additional testing of all of those locations, and we've established some new ones that we're going to try and use to delineate the surface water impacts and understand if there's any seasonal effects. So is it worse in the summer? Is it better in the winter? Is it bad all of the time? In the groundwater, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to monitor all of the wells on the site, and we're going to make sure that everything at the site is the same concentration year-round. For the potable water, as I mentioned, we only had those 2 dwellings with exceedances and the 1 dwelling that was approaching a guideline. Those 3 dwellings we have proposed to carry forward in the next round of sampling to be protective of the water quality. Since the rest of the homes had no exceedances of any of the chemical parameters, we've recommended no further testing at those homes. And that concludes my formal presentation. So I'm going to give the floor back to Pam.
Sure. Thanks, Evan. So if anybody has questions, and I'm sure you do, we just need you one at a time to come up to the microphone because we're streaming this. and one question at a time, and Evan will respond to that. So I'll put you, press that, somebody. Yeah, I have to recognize it, though. Sandy, would you mind turning her light on for me? There we go. Good. Good. Perfect. So you'll stay on.
Test 1, 2. My name's Garnet Horton. I live in the town of Yarmouth. Have some questions for you, have some questions for council. How much money has this cost the town to date? And when are we going to get a breakdown on the costs of all of this? So to date, we got a figure on how much the town spent on this?
That.
All told, ballpark, don't have a number specifically in front of me, 125 to 135,000.
You say my question is how much more testing is necessary and at what expense? So you're saying 135,000 to date. What's a ballpark figure? Do you figure we're going to estimate to do the rest of this testing? She answered the other part of my question all year round.
Okay, I have those numbers, and they are going to council later tonight. Over the course of a year, in the order of $80,000.
So, from these tests that you've done, that you're coming out with, and while you're doing the rest of the tests in there, what's the doubt? You know, is there any doubt, any health risk to anybody out there? Any of these homes? Because I don't understand why Adam has not been supplied with clean drinking water for himself and his family when there's quite a bit of doubt of what's going on right there next to that site.
We have done 2 full rounds of testing on all of the potable water, and as I mentioned, there were only 2 homes that had anything that exceeded and other than the 3rd home even approached a guideline.
Yeah, but why is the surface water over the whole site all polluted? Where's that coming from? If it isn't coming from the so-called garbage or the compost that we've got there. Where's that coming? I don't understand how you can say you can drill an 8-foot well and the surface water is contaminated, and then you go down to his dug well and he's got chemicals in his dug well. If the surface water is contaminated, it's contaminated all over there. And his well isn't leaking. We haven't had enough rain. The ground is dry.
So we feel there are several isolated locations that there were surface spills of the wood treatment chemical that was being used on that site. And in the locations that they were spilled, they are migrating to water in those wetlands and running off site.
He doesn't live in a wetland. He's at the top of the hill.
That's it exactly. His well is up above these areas that we've seen the impacts.
But the water still runs down his driveway and runs down the other way and runs down the other road right behind those other people's houses. I've been there in the rainstorms and watched it.
Yeah.
So you're telling me, I'm expected to believe this, that there's no contamination that can get to his wells from that site because of where he is. Is that what you're saying to me?
To date, we have not seen any contamination in Adam's dug well.
Yeah, and you've only done 2 tests. Boy, I don't know.
That's the standard.
Another question is, why does the town have insurance for the surrounding properties there and doesn't have any insurance for the site? Why is that? This was told to me by Mr. Langell and Mr. Mooney, that you have insurance, Councillor Mooney and Councillor Langell, that there's insurance for the surrounding properties on the site.
I never said that, Barney.
Yes, you did.
No, I didn't. I never said that.
Yeah, you did.
I never said it. I don't know anything about insurance. I never said it.
Okay.
I never
Okay,
said it,
Phil.
Garrett.
You didn't say
I
it.
tell everybody in the audience I never talk about insurance because I don't know anything.
Ken definitely said it to me. for sure, and I know you were there. But we can't prove that because Ken's gone, huh?
Okay,
Okay,
so,
I'm asking you the question.
so we're gonna let our solicitor answer that. Go ahead.
Well, all I can say is I reviewed the town policy, and there's no coverage for the cleanup of town-owned property within that insurance policy.
Can I say something, Your Worship?
Certainly.
I categorically deny that I said anything about any insurance on that property because I didn't ask Jeff or anybody, I didn't ask Greg, and I did not know what is in or included in any town insurance policies. To go out on a limb and say anything about insurance, Karen, me and you were friends, but I didn't say it.
Well, I'm pretty sure you did, Phil.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that Ken did, but we'll let it go. Maybe you didn't, maybe it was just Ken, but
Yeah,
that
well-
was told to me.
Okay, so what's the next question?
How come the stewards of the watershed committee were not consulted before this stuff was shipped out to Lake George? The chair of the Lake George was Mr. Langell? Councilor Langell? Okay, how come they weren't consulted on that?
Go ahead.
Yes, the primary reason would be it's outside of the watershed. The area where the compost was taken is outside of the watershed, and so the watershed regulations don't apply to that area.
I don't know why they wouldn't apply, Jeff. The water runs down to the lake, and, you know, we were told.
Yeah,
But it's outside of the watershed. So,
Yeah, I know.
so the
But
question
we were
was,
told it never ran to the lake, Your Worship. We were told the water doesn't reach the lake. That was the first thing. And just like it was Class B compost. We all agree it isn't Class B compost now, don't we? The second part of the question is, who's the chair of the Lake George watershed now?
that's me. No, that's you.
Okay? Your Worship, you asked the deputy mayor why he hasn't called a meeting to explain to these people what's going on, because they're supposed to be the stewards of the watershed, and no. They're supposed to be in on all this stuff. How come? I mean, we have a no-fly zone over the lake. I mean, we talked about four-wheelers going around the lake, but yet we just go and put that garbage out there, and there hasn't been a meeting called. I think the gentlemen are right here, and they haven't had a meeting called in over 2 years.
Okay, so just to be clear, he's only been the chair for a couple months. And we're in the middle of all this. I think the information's getting to where it needs to get.
Well, I think, you know, the way that this has gone and the way it's come about, it's one of the most important things that have happened to the town, or, you know, that everybody should be kept in, and we're gonna to be transparent and everything, and then these people are sit on that watershed commission and have faithfully, and they haven't been informed?
Oh, whoa.
This
yeah,
doesn't
that-
make sense.
No, it does, because everything that we've done has been basically through Englobe, and that has all been posted to the website. And anybody wants information on what we're doing, it's on the website.
Your Worship,
So
you're missing the point. It's not what's been done by Englobe or everything that's going to be posted on Englobe. If we might have did this before, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about the problems that we have now.
Okay.
Next one, why are the people of Lake George, no, excuse me, that one I know.
These are questions for,
How come there hasn't been a formal investigation started to find out how this is happening and hold the people accountable for their incompetency?
because that's been taken care of in-house, and the questions are regarding the report.
Are we going to get a copy of this report? Is this, you know,
No.
we don't know what's
I'm
taking...
I'm talking about the questions this evening are for Ms. Cole regarding the report.
But I would like to know is how we got to this point, what investigation has been done to this point to find out why we're in the situation that we're in. I don't want to hear that, you know, I made a mistake, or this one made a mistake, or I'm sorry that I did this. I want to know actually how this got carried out through the chain
Okay.
of command, and this stuff got put on the lake, and to the price, whatever, over 200,000 by the end of the year? Doesn't make sense. And the other question I have to council is, how come the CAO does not have to live in this town, but the mayor, the councilors do? It was his mistake, and he apologized to the people of Lake George at the meeting about it. But this does not affect his property, his taxes,
Okay.
his water, or anything. Does it?
Okay.
Mr. Gushu, it doesn't
Any,
affect
do you have any questions about the report?
you. What's wrong with that question? Now, I want you to bring this up in council. I'd like to know.
Why staff doesn't have to live in town?
Well, it doesn't affect him one way or
Probably
another. It's
half
not
the
going to
staff
affect his
doesn't.
taxes. It's not going to affect his water bills or
Okay.
anything.
You know what?
What?
Enough of that question.
What do you mean enough of that question?
Enough of that question. Do you have another
You can
question?
take this to council and give us an answer afterwards.
No, no, we're not going there.
You know, well, why wouldn't you go there? You don't think that's an important issue? You live in this town. You pay the same taxes as I do.
Yes, I do.
Well, you're representing the people of the town, Pam.
Yes, I am.
Well, don't you think a formal investigation ought to be warranted to find out how this went down instead of just a conversation over the office, an outside investigation come in here and see why we're in the position that we're in right now? Seriously. I think anybody in this room wants to know, and I think there's a lot more people in the town that really want to know. It's our money that's paying for it. So, what do? We have a mayor from Weymouth that can come down and be mayor in Yarmouth?
No,
Do we have a councilor that can come from out of town and be?
no, but we have staff that can be from out of town. That's the end of that's it.
Yeah, that does not make sense to me. And I put in this, a resolution for the bylaws should be passed that requires that the CAO, as well as town council's members, to the residents of the town of Yarmouth. This could help to ensure empathy with the townspeople affected by various decisions and policy initiatives, while also helping to protect the integrity in the decision-making process insofar as the people are less likely to be negligent. When the consequences of poor decisions or policies will negatively affect.
Okay, first of all,
What?
I said at the beginning of the meeting, it was about questions for Ms. Cole with regard to the report.
Okay, Pam, you want to play that way, you go ahead.
I'm not playing a game. It's not a game,
No,
but if
you
you
just
think I'm
being-
going to sit here while you sit there and insult staff and accuse, it's not going to
I'm not
happen.
insulting staff, this is a statement that, you know, this is an important
Do you have any
important
more
issue.
questions for Ms. Cole?
I sure do. So, for you, 70% of the moisture in a so-called compost or garbage is held in that soil. How come there's been no recommendation from the beginning of this to tarp that over so it doesn't blow in the woods? I don't think we have to worry about it now because we got a jungle growing in there and you were out there today, so you should have seen that. How come in the recommendation and when you first come on that site that you never thought to tarp that over? So that growth isn't growing because that's going to give us another problem to deal with.
That's outside the scope of the investigation we did in March. We looked at groundwater, soil, sediment, and surface water quality. By March, we were convinced there was no chemical contamination in the compost, and it was removed from the investigative program.
How many soil samples did you take of the compost?
One.
One sample. You GPS where you took that sample from?
Yes, I did.
Did you? And you know how many more were taken off that 10-acre site?
There was adequate testing done from the plant and from Dr. Arnold's testing back in February.
Which would be one sample that you took, one sample that he took, and two samples that they gave him out to the landfill on all that soil that was put out there. So, water, compost, and saturation of the ground equals what? Leachate? Do you think that that's what's happening on the lower end of that field, down in the pond where it's bubbling out of the ground? Because we haven't had any rain, and you've got, it looks like leachate to me. You were out there this morning down, I don't know which end it is, but down at the lower end, did you check that? Did you look at that?
Say, no, the compost is not causing leachate to migrate off the site.
Well, then what's causing the surface water to be contaminated? Explain that to me, if you can.
There was likely a chemical spill 10 years ago when there were wood treatment products on the site.
And you think that that's running over that whole site where that so-called compost B was put? You know, like if we get into the Food Administration Act, you're only allowed to have a little bit of that, not, 300 to 500 tandem loads. You're saying that as a professional. You don't think that that's coming from that compost?
No,
On the surface water?
no.
Just wait till,
Well, I don't know. I find that hard to believe myself with the way the wells have gone, the way Bob's Pond is discolored and everything, and we know that it's running down into the culverts and it's running down on the land. We know that it's going to the lake, even though we weren't told that. That a big problem has to be coming from the soil, and we have no way of proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that that soil was cooked right to the right temperature before it went out there. And if you were there when the snow was coming out of the ground and it was just bubbling out of the ground and turning the snow the nastiest color you ever want to see, what would be causing that?
Say, I can't comment on it because I didn't see it.
You didn't see it. Councilor Dennis, did you see it? Yes, you did. You were out on the site. Well, I guess we're not going to get many answers here. I'm not directing all my questions to you. But I'll tell you one thing. This is my opinion only, and my questions and statements that I've said here. And in my opinion, Mr. Gushu, you should be fired, and Pam, you should resign. Because this is the most incompetent council we've ever had in our history of our town.
yeah. Okay, more questions?
Yep, just for a second, I only get a couple. I only got one. Hi, my name's Scott Killam. I own land right next to the compost area. The area that you showed on there was where the pond used to be, is that correct? Where they had the deep pond?
The deep pond was the area that we saw
and
the
that-
worst of the surface water, yes.
Yeah, okay, so that is probably about 1,000 feet from my well. And you've checked my well and you came up with the conclusion that there wasn't, you know, but I'm just wondering, I own the land next to it as well, and the swamp water that you drew a line, and that was your border line or your property line, and that borders on my property line, and all that swamp area there, it's all one big swamp. So would mine be contaminated with, did you took samples out of that swamp as well?
We took samples out of the swamp, and we took samples at the discharge point of the swamp.
Yeah, and both, I have a discharge, there's areas where the swamp comes behind my property and then behind my well and then drains down between my brother's and my property and goes down across to the fire pond and then down into Killam's, down towards Killam's Lake. Was that area tested?
So I could pull back the map if it's
Yeah,
useful.
well, I didn't see no test holes, or not test holes, but any sample spots on that. I was wondering, like, because all that water is diverted around past my well and goes down through and down through that way. So would surface water have a chance to go down around my well and then down through there?
So-
Was there samples taken in the fire pond, for instance?
We did not take any samples in the fire pond because we did not see any evidence that water was making it
Well,
from that deep
whole
pond on the site.
That whole swamp, when I built my house there, it was close to my well. So I dug a channel across my brother's property to divert the water so that it wouldn't be right to my well. And so that the water, originally that water, all that swamp drained towards the brook that goes by the church. All that water had to go that way. And by putting this canal, I'll call it, and divert it down through culvert, it diverted it around my piece of property because I'm on a hill, basically. And theoretically, that water could be contaminated with whatever chemicals so that could be going down through that way. I mean, it's the natural flow was that direction. So I never received any letter saying that my land could have been contaminated or.
So you wouldn't have received a letter if we didn't have test results that were on your property that exceeded a guideline. But I can tell you the wetland that borders that old pond on the sawmill site, we walked the entire boundary of it, and we determined that in its configuration right now, the water draining from it goes down between the church and I believe it's Beth Evans' house, and through a culvert and down behind Bob Gray's house.
Even though the water, when you were doing the tests around my well, was, you could see it. It was like early in the spring and the snow melt and everything. It was, water was, you
So we were
feel in
there.
your opinion that it didn't
They weren't.
come my direction?
No, they didn't appear to be connected when we did the field work in March, and there was a lot of water in March, so we would have noticed if there had been a connection.
I look at the theory, if you had a bucket of water and you put something in this bucket of water, it's going to go over to this side of the bucket as well as the other way of the bucket. I mean, it's going to reach a natural flow, and if it can't go out this way, it'll go that way. But the water's roaring down through that into the fire pond most of the spring. I can't see why.
That water in the fire pond, when we ground truthed where water was flowing, we didn't see the connection with that wetland that was really close to the Ibbotson site and the water flowing into the fire
Okay.
pond.
When I dug my well, I went through about 10 feet of hard pan, and then I hit a shale, a brown shale. You mentioned a brown shale at one of the meetings, that's where the fire pond. Is there a chance that that water that's in that can travel through in the shale layer into my well?
So the water from the Ibbotson site flows off it radially, so it flows off in a circle. It's going in all directions. But we didn't see any connection between that shallow water in the top 25 feet and the deeper water in anybody's neighboring well.
So how do you recall ever finding out how deep the pond was originally?
We didn't find any records on exactly how deep it was, but we dug test pits on either side of it and around it. And I don't recall exactly, but I don't believe soil was much deeper than about 12 or 13 feet. Until you hit the top of the rock, yeah.
Yeah, before we hit the hard pan, or the rock.
The rock,
ledge,
and it was
okay.
gray rock in that location.
Yeah, well, I was just curious if there was a chance for traveling in the shale to my
Yeah,
well.
we don't see that as a migration pathway. We see the migration in the surface water, likely from these hot spots, that, 10 years later, we're never going to find a spot that somebody might have kicked a bucket of chemical over in the woods.
All right. Well, that's the only questions I have at this moment. I'll give the microphone to someone else.
Thank you, sir.
How you folks doing today? It's good. Got some questions here for you, I guess. We direct everything towards you. Adam Russell.
Bob Gray.
Water quality. It says the report identifies.
Can, there we go.
And don't quote me on some of these words that I'm going to try and pronounce, because I'll tell you what, they're outside my pay grade, I'll tell you right now. The report identifies trihelomethanes and pentachloric phenol, that would be chlorinated phenols, in samples collected from monitoring well 10, monitoring well 11, potable water 1, and potable water 2, groundwater, in addition to 6 drinking water samples collected from adjacent residents' property. These compounds are associated with PQ8, which is known to have been used at the site under investigation. These compounds are persistent and accumulative human carcinogens and pose a significant human health risk. What is the identified source of the chlorinated phenols?
Okay, so you told me monitor well,
It
please
would be
refresh my
monitor-
memory.
monitor
Okay,
11, potable water 1 and 2.
so monitor well 10,
11,
I'm looking at 10, bear with me. Monitor well 10 in groundwater had a low concentration of creosote. It had a low concentration of total phenol. Of all the various other phenol products, we did not see any. They were non-detect. In monitor well 11, I do not see any detections of any of those phenol products. And your other ones were potable well.
1 and potable well 2.
Is this data from the first round of testing? From the February testing?
Yes.
So I can easily address 10 and 11. 11 didn't have anything in it.
Okay.
So monitor well 10 had a little bit of creosote and it had a little bit of total phenol.
Okay.
Because we didn't see any of those parameters in any of the other monitor wells, we attribute it to a piece of treated wood that likely had been used in a building, it had been used in a fence, something of that nature, that was buried in the fill at that site.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. The report identifies the presence of creosote in groundwater at monitoring well 9 and monitoring well 11. What is the identified source of the creosote?
There is no creosote in monitor well 11. It was in monitor well 10. Yeah, there is no creosote in monitor well 11. There's no creosote in monitor well 9. It was in monitor well 10.
Just 10?
And it's
None in
probably
9?
none in
None in
9,
9 and
no.
none in 11.
And it's probably that same, there was a bit of remnant wood that somebody had built a fence or a building with that had been treated with those chemicals. So something imported to the site.
Okay. The report identifies the presence of mercury in groundwater of 9 and 11 as well. Monitoring well 9 and 11. What is the identified source of that?
So there was a detection of mercury in monitor well 11 and monitor well 9 that both were below the guidelines.
But they were present.
They were present.
Okay. You don't know the source.
I don't know the source. Mercury can be natural to the environment. Mercury can be introduced from a chemical.
Okay, thank you. The construction of monitoring well 1S, monitoring well 3S, and monitoring well 6S, monitoring well 7, monitoring well 8, and monitoring well 9, also 10, all show the water elevation above the top of the screen elevation. This is not a generally accepted monitoring well configuration, as the LNAPLS are likely not detected when the water elevation exceeds the screen elevation. In fact, perylene, I would say, or pyrene, were detected in monitoring well 5, which were probably constructed with the screen elevation above the water elevation.
So
So, in consideration of the high water table at the site, is the existing condition of monitoring well 1S, monitoring well 3S, and monitoring well 6, monitoring well 7, monitoring well 8, monitoring well 9, and also 10, likely to have any impact on the due diligence aspect of the report?
it does not. The monitor well results were interpreted as in conjunction with the groundwater levels we observed in the physical test pits that we dug. Soil conditions at the site are, in some locations, very tight, non-permeable clay and or monitor wells in rock. When there is upward pressure of the groundwater table, it is going to raise up in a monitor well, similar to an artesian condition. So as soon as you puncture the confining layer, the water level is going to rise in that tube until it hits atmospheric pressure.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
With the contour intervals missing in the figures, it is difficult to determine the evaluation differences as they might relate to surface water and groundwater flow. For example, the groundwater elevation in MW4 and MW5 cannot be adequately explained by the respective well logs when considered in light of the adjacent wetland. With the anomaly of discolored water being visible, discharge under pressure at the site, does the report adequately delineate and describe the surface water and groundwater dynamics, especially with potable water wells in use on adjacent properties? What is the source and composition of the water being discharged on the surface under pressure?
With the exception of one location where we dug a test pit, we did not see surface water or shallow groundwater raising to the surface. We saw that at one location where we had dug a test pit down by the big dug pond on the north end of the site.
There was one location there. There was also one up just south of his place as well, huh?
Where the tank was, wasn't there a lot of water in that area?
There was a lot of water in several locations of the property, and that was due to the nature in which the buildings were demolished at the site, and the holes were backfilled with building foundation materials.
Okay. That's
You remember that?
This report is, okay, in the report tables, give several different RDLs for the same parameters depending on the sample location. This is usually usually the case, I guess. No, this question has got me all messed up here. I'm jumping places. Just disregard that for now. Yes, this is a better copy. In the report, the tables give several different RDLs for the same parameters depending on the sample location. When the sample is, or this is usually the case, when the sample is insignificant in some manner, will these parameters be resampled if the RDLs are above the guidelines? Low pH is noted throughout the surface water investigation, most notable in water courses at the site. What is the identified case or cause of the low pH conditions?
So your first question about the RDLs, if the RDLs are in excess of the guidelines, we would do more investigation at those locations, but at this point, I don't expect that we will see that case.
Okay.
For the depressed pH, the nature of the chemicals that were used in the wood preservation, they were low in pH. So PQ8 is a low pH product. There was another product potentially used. It was called Sapsin. It's an ammonia-based product, which would also have a low pH.
Okay. Go ahead with the next one. Where'd be here?
The water samples collected by residents within residential potable waters and on the site, potable wells on the site, including water courses leaving the site towards Lake George and Killam's Lake, indicate elevated chlorinated phenol levels. please comment on the determination in the context of this report?
So water samples collected by Englobe or water samples collected by the residents?
By the residents.
I can't comment on those because I didn't see your sampling protocol.
I think,
We
I
saw-
believe you guys had a copy of the water sample reports from, you did?
Not the process. We saw,
They just seen the report.
Okay,
What's
you
just
seen the
saying they
report.
never seen us take them, so they're obsolete. So we could feel mutual on that. I never seen you take half of your water samples also, right?
Yeah, so
So-
there is a very regulated lab procedure for every chemical sample that we test. And we work with these chemicals on a regular basis and receive clarification from the lab when we're unsure. I can't comment on results when I didn't see the bottles they were collected in, the preservatives that might have been used, were they refrigerated, how long did they sit before they went to the lab. I can't comment on any of those parameters, which would have a large impact on the results.
The presence of the chlorinated phenols, let's just say that, and chloroform are attributed to the composition of organic matter in the presence of chlorinated water. As this site is an isolated royal property with no chlorinated water supply, please elaborate on the formation of these chlorinated, trihalomethanes and chloroform at the site as detected in PW3, PW7, as well as the more general issue of chlorine-related compounds at this royal site.
I only recall PW3 having trimethylhalenes and chloroform. There might have been another well that had it. I don't recall off the top of my head. But if you have organic matter in a well and you shock chlorinate your well, the reaction of the chlorine in the shock chlorination tablet and the organic matter in the well cause trimethylhalenes.
Okay. Next.
Multiple parameters at monitoring well 1 and monitoring well 2 exceed applicable guidelines for groundwater, occasionally by order of magnitude. In consideration of the proximity of monitoring well 1 and monitoring well 2 to residential properties, do you conclude that the groundwater conditions at MW1 and MW2 pose no potential impact to the groundwater beneath those residential properties, especially as water flow is described as radial from source of contamination?
Okay, monitor well 1 and monitor well 2, which report are you referring to?
Pardon?
Which report are you referring to, the February report or the May report?
I'm going to say I'm not 100% sure, but it's, I'm sure it would be. I'm not 100%, so we'll leave it at that.
I am
I'll
going to
get back to
hazard
you
a
on that
guess.
question.
It was the February report.
Mm-hmm.
The crock on the site was called Monitor Well 1 in the February sampling.
Right.
Water was taken from that crock. It contained excessive amounts of turbidity, and to be protective of the freshwater habitat environment it was discharging to, we did not filter that sample. That is why there are so many elevated metals in that sample. We subsequently ran a filtered sample of that location, and the metals were greatly reduced. I don't believe that second analytical
were they
package was
still-
ever reported, though.
Were they still elevated?
I don't recall. Ultimately, the water in that crock discharges into the wetland at the point we established a surface water sampling location.
Okay.
So empirically, we would have tested its discharge.
Go next. Straight. What is the nature of the geological substrate at the site, and what does the investigation determine regarding the dynamics of the groundwater flow?
The geology at the site was highly variable. We saw different geological formations. Ultimately, we felt they had no direct bearing on the contamination issues we saw at the surface water.
Okay. You're all set.
Some of the parameters determined to exceed guidelines are quite mobile on water as well as soil and pose significant human health risk. Given the proximity of potable water supplies, can Englobe say with certainty that there is no health risk to the residents adjacent to the site with respect to ingestion or other means of absorption?
We only saw 3 soil locations that had metals parameters that were over the agricultural guidelines. So the agricultural guidelines are unforested woodland use, people growing vegetables for human consumption. Of those detections, several of them actually satisfied the residential land use guideline. All of the soil exceedances that we saw, they were in deeper subsurface soil. There were none at the surface that would have made them available for contact by any of the residents.
So you can say with certainty there will be no impact to human health?
I can say with certainty there's no impact to human health
Today. but
from
what
the
about-
soil,
Okay.
And there won't be?
and there won't be.
Okay. Where were potable water samples collected from the source? Were they collected from the source, or they collected from the tap, and in the reports that you've taken?
In the February reports, some were collected at the source, some were collected at the taps, some were collected at outside hoses based on resident availability at the time of sampling. During our subsequent round, we attempted wherever humanly possible to collect water directly from the well or where the well directly came into the house. So pre-treatment, pre-plumbing.
So we excluded the plumbing part of that issue?
We tried to exclude the plumbing part of the issue wherever possible, yes.
So we've clarified that, okay?
Please address the issue of surface and soil contamination and whether there is any health risk to the residents adjacent to the site with respect to windborne or waterborne soil products.
There was no impacted soil at the surface,
Yeah.
so there is no impact.
Next question. It is noted in the report that the concentrations of aluminum in potable water may be attributed to Nova Scotia soils and therefore not attributed to site contamination. Given the report exceeds of over 100 times the allowable limit, please address the presence of aluminum and whether these elevated levels are common in our region.
Aluminum is very common in our region. We have aluminum in our bedrock, and almost all of our soils are derived from bedrock sources. So they're very common across the region. There's unfortunately no background soil mapping of the Yarmouth area. In Halifax, the numbers we see are very representative of what's naturally available in the soil.
So they will exceed 100 times.
They will exceed 100 times in cases.
Is the background information, location, and data included in the report for reference? Does the background geology differ from the site geology?
The background surface water location?
You use a background number in the report. That's what you refer to, a background. We're just asking, is it in the report to look at?
For aluminum?
No, for all your background, you refer to a background. It's consistent with the background you say in the report.
I don't understand which parameter that you're talking about.
In the background information, location, and the data included in the report For reference, does the background geology differ from the site geology? So where you've taken, where your background location, I assume you said it was at a gated road, you drove down, took a soil sample. Is the geology different in that area, or is it the same as the site?
We took a background surface water sample at that location, and the geology is the same.
It's the same.
Yes.
Okay.
The presence of the elevated metals is attributed to the operations of the Ibbotson sawmill in the report summary. There is evidence of a release of liquid contents of PQ8 from the dip tank. Could such a release be a potential source of the contaminants of this site?
It could, but we are not seeing a transport mechanism between the shallow groundwater at the site and other locations off-site.
Okay.
Are the I can't even pronounce that, constituents of the PQ8 or the associated products of the decomposition consistent with the type of contaminants determined to be present in the soil and water at the site?
So PQ8 is predominantly a metals-based product. The byproducts would not degrade into anything different than those constituent metals.
Could I get you to elaborate on which metals?
Copper,
Got you stumped.
I
Stump me
I
too.
can see the page in my file, and I can't remember the words on the page. Copper is certainly one of them, lead, arsenic. Basic, depending on the producer, there could be other things in it.
Okay.
The report states that recommendations for follow-up will be provided under separate cover. As impacted third parties, we have a valid interest in the follow-up. Have these recommendations been made, and what is the reason for being provided under separate cover?
I provided the recommendations under separate cover to provide a natural break in the report when it is forwarded to Nova Scotia Environment for their file process.
Okay, so I trust that the town got a copy of
The
that?
town has a formal copy of the follow-up recommendations and the scope and the budget, and that's on the agenda for later tonight.
Okay,
I
so
believe it
are
has,
we going to get a copy of this, or, because we had all agreed to be transparent, correct? Or is it none of our business?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the proposal is and has been on our website since Friday, and it is, as Avon mentioned, it's on the agenda for tonight. So Englobe has made their recommendations, and my recommendation to council is they accept it as presented, unmodified. So we're sticking to our commitment to follow the professional advice, not to waver from it. So the details are on the website, and maybe Avon can speak a little bit to it.
I have a copy of the proposal here. I can go through it now, or we can go through it when I present it to council.
Sure, everybody would like to hear it.
Okay, absolutely.
Here for information.
Just bear with me while I organize myself. Okay, so as summarized in our report, we had very isolated occurrences of soil impacts. We had very isolated occurrences of groundwater impacts at the site. We propose to deal with those by collecting quarterly groundwater samples at the site over the course of a year to confirm that those occurrences are isolated, they are not mobile, and they are causing no harm. Okay. The soil, it's in deeper subsoil. It's not available for anybody to access in its current location. We're going to go through a desktop exercise just to validate that there is no opportunity for that soil to be made available to anybody on site. potable water, we only had 2 locations with exceedances and 1 location with an approaching exceedance. All the other potable water samples, they satisfied 2 rounds of sampling. At this point, we've recommended carrying forward the 3 locations with exceedances and no further testing at the remaining potable wells. The surface water is most concerning. The guidelines for surface water are protective of freshwater habitat. So as I mentioned, the fish, the bugs, the other animals that might be present. We recommended that we further delineate those surface water impacts. So we follow the migration path of all that surface water to where it discharges at the respective lakes. So at Killam Lake and at Lake George. We have various sampling locations that we are going to establish. We have an idea of where they're going to be. We haven't fine-tuned them because it really depends on exactly where water flows in the field. So surface water guidelines, they're much, much, much more protective than human health, right? We want to make sure that we're not affecting the fish. The fish is the big thing. Fish are probably the most sensitive thing we're going to find. We want to make sure, we want to assess the connectivity of those water features to see if fish are available to get into them. And we want to look long-term at the chemical quality over the span of a year to see if there's any high points, if there's any low points, is it steady state? Okay. At the conclusion of all that surface water sampling, we're going to try and come up with the most practical method to move forward to address the surface water impacts. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to be at this point. The results may bear a recommendation of we see no impact. The recommendations may result in we think you should remediate these select areas. And it could be something in between. We really won't know until the final testing's done. Okay. At the end of this process, so as you're all aware, the surface water has triggered the contaminated sites regulations with Nova Scotia Environment, and we are moving forward down the pathway with the town as the source site, and the third-party impacted parcels where this surface water is traveling over. So we'll have some paperwork to do for Nova Scotia Environment to satisfy their paperwork process, and ultimately, at the end of this year testing, we're going to prepare a remedial action plan so that we can move forward with the surface water impacts. Okay?
Is that everything?
I believe that's everything.
All right. Any more questions?
Okay, when the dip tank was there in June of 2004, there was a phase 3 environmental test, only showed zinc above the acceptable levels, okay? After the tank was removed in 2005, 2006, there were test wells put in place. And the questions are, why were these wells put in? And number 2, where are the analytical results of these wells? Can't seem to find them.
Those wells were installed as part of a property transaction receivership action on the Ibbotson site, and those results are tabulated in our May 2016 report. They're in the data tables.
You've got it, do you? Or?
Yeah, they're identified, usually in brackets, JWA.
It's in brackets for what?
Oh, I apologize. We seem to have dropped the JWA in this version of the report. But if you look in data table 9, for instance,
Data table.
Monitor Well 2S has a sample result from November of 2005. Monitor Well 11 has a sample result from November 2005, as does Monitor Well 12.
You have can I have a copy of those? Or?
They are in the report that's published on the website.
They are.
They are table 9.
Pardon?
Table 9 is the metals. Table 8 is general chemistry. Table 10 and 11 do not have those results because Jakes Whitford did not test the parameters in those two tables. So tables 8 and tables 9 are where you'll find them.
Where were those wells installed at that time? Because the phase 3 had been completed by the receiver, and then the town took control of the property, and then these wells were put in.
So as a due diligence activity, the town, I believe, commissioned Jakes Whitford to install the wells to further investigate results of the phase 3.
But if there was nothing there but zinc at the time,
And at the time, surface impacts may not have migrated into those wells.
what we're saying, we've just had a conflict because now we're saying that these are not mobile. These contaminants you say are isolated, they're not mobile, they're not moving, but they weren't there before, but they're there now.
They weren't there before, they're only in 2 wells now. So in the span of 10 years, if they're not in any other wells other than those 2 that I circled on that plan, that in our
So
opinion
what-
means they're not mobile.
So it has nothing to do with the contaminated surface water.
It may be a result of water that came out of the diking around those tanks. We're really not sure at this point. That was 10 years ago.
But it's mobile.
But I can tell you in 10 years, if you only have 2 wells at the top of the site that have those impacts, and you don't see it in any of the surrounding wells, it's not mobile.
So what are we worried about fish and other things for if it hasn't left the site?
So this is in shallow groundwater, 0 to 20, 25 feet.
0 to 25 feet? That's what we're talking about for surface water?
No, for surface water, that's water that is directly running on the surface of the ground. Shallow groundwater is 0 to 25 feet.
And that's what we're
That-
talking about, that's,
And that's where we saw the 2 arsenic impacts in the monitor wells.
okay. All right, thank you.
Okay. What are the 3 wells you're going to continue testing?
The 3 potable wells?
Yeah.
Am I allowed to say the civic numbers, or should I keep
I think
the
everybody's here, and
PW?
I think everybody's here from Lake George, so.
Is anybody not okay with us saying what they are? Put your hand up if you're not okay with us telling you.
Just give us the addresses.
2087, so that's your house, Bob.
28.
Sorry, 2087 is the Nickersons. 2065, which is your house. And the drilled well at the Ibbotson site, which is connected to Adam's house. Those are the 3 wells.
No, we need to, questions from up here.
You'll have to ask up here.
Well, just come up when you're, just,
Question for from a resident, are the other wells all safe?
In 2 rounds of sampling at all of those other wells, we saw no parameters that even approached the guidelines. So there were no issues in the water that we tested.
Okay, thank you.
The property there, is it deemed watershed or not? I guess, I'm going to direct this one to Jeff, I guess. The Lake George property that the mill was on. okay?
2014.
What's that? Yeah.
2014.
Is that deemed watershed
So,
inside the watershed area?
so the watershed is a separate line from property boundaries. So there is a designated watershed, and the line does cut through that property, but it cuts on the lake side of that clearing.
So that property wasn't, the
It's-
whole pit wasn't tagged as watershed area?
No, and that's not the way it works. So the watershed regulations are registered on every property that, at least in part, is within the watershed. But the only part of the property that is impacted by the regulations is that portion that is within, between the watershed line and the lake.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks for your time.
thanks, gentlemen. Okay.
Hi, I'm Steph Nickerson. I just have a quick question. You answered a lot of stuff there, and that was awesome. You were saying that you're going to continue on with testing at 2087. Earlier last week, I believe, some impact letters came out. I never got one.
They did.
I wasn't impacted, but you're going to come and test my well?
They were notification reports as part of the regulated processes Nova Scotia environment.
So that means, in layman's terms?
So if you have contamination at your site that's over one of the guidelines that's published, we notified on those properties. So we notified on the town Ibbotson site, and I believe there were 4 other residents with surface water that ran across their property with impacts in it.
And you said that the stream that comes down between the church and goes down across the road between Bobby's house and my house is affected?
It is affected. I think it's on Bob's property.
It actually comes across my property as well. Chad came to my house and he physically saw with his eyes that it does cross across my property as well.
Turns at the back and goes back across.
Well, I wasn't physically in the woods, but it does go across my property, especially when the rain is hot, like when the water level raises in the river, that comes right across my property.
Okay, so where we sampled, we picked up the locations with GPS, and I know there was some question that your property boundaries were not correct on Service Nova Scotia, and we had a really hard time figuring out where they actually are supposed to be. So based on my sample locations and the GPS pickup, and where Chad measured and we thought your property boundary was, we didn't see that that water was crossing you. Now, maybe it does when we go back in hindsight, and we do have more work planned, and we're mapping those water features, and we will look harder at it.
So the impact letters, back to that, they were only for people that you felt at the time were impacted?
At the time that we had documented samples in hand. So
Okay,
Nova Scotia Environment doesn't want us to speculate. They only want to enter the process when you have documented impacts.
Okay, so when it was documented that we had the highest level of lead back, and we were impacted.
So in February,
Yep.
we took your first water sample from your hose outside.
Yep. You took it from somewhere, sure.
Yeah,
I wasn't physically there to see it.
Yeah, came from your hose outside. Your second water sample, we took as your well enters your house. So your first one was really high.
The second one was in my house, actually.
Yeah, it was in your house at the immediate spot where the water line comes through your foundation wall. Your first one was really high. Your second one was non-detect. And I would suspect you have lead plumbing in your house.
I do not.
You do not?
I do not.
Okay. Or perhaps lead solder.
I do not.
Okay. So as part of our sampling that we're carrying on with, we plan to sample at the location where your water comes in your house. We plan to sample at your kitchen sink. And we're going to compare the results.
Okay, so there will be much ongoing testing.
There will be 4 more sampling events at your house for your drinking water.
Perfect. Thank
Okay.
you very much.
Good evening. I'm Doris Powell. In reading the report that you came out with, in there it talked about anthropomorphic, and that in some of the places where the levels were off the charts, and I'm using that term myself, that they appeared to be of anthropomorphic origin. So in other words, they would not be something that occurred in nature. So my question is, did you do background samples? I know you said that in Halifax there's already backgrounds in place, but did you actually do background samples there at the Lake George location?
We did a surface water background sample because the soil results, for the most part, didn't show anything. We did not do any soil background testing. As part of our next phase of work, and I believe I might have missed this in my summary to Adam and Bob, we are going to try and establish a background wetland location. So in the place that we saw the worst surface water quality, we're going to try and find a wetland similar in origin and nature and test the water quality in that wetland and see how it compares to that bad location.
Okay, so as far as anthropomorphic origins, would that be somewhere near where the dip tank was plowed into the ground?
We saw the worst of the impacts down by the dug pond that was used to spray
Okay,
the
so the
lumber.
wastewater pond, which is where it would actually go? I'm calling it the wastewater pond. Have you seen the picture of Ibbotson's mill when it was in operation?
It was a pond that was used to store water and spray the lumber.
Yeah, that's
So
the
worst-
wastewater pond.
yeah. So the worst of
which-
the impacts we found down in that area.
Right, which at the time I have pictures of it having from the wastewater pond, and then there's an actual stream that goes from there all the way directly into Lake George. So it was literally going right into Lake George. Okay, so other question, do you think it's a good idea, this is just I want to know your personal opinion, do you think it's a good idea to have a big concrete tank of 60,000 gallons of PQ8 and to plow it into the ground, including the chemical? Do you think that's a good idea, especially near water? Do you think that's a good idea?
So you're talking about
Drinking
something
water.
that now happened 10 years ago. It was regulated and approved by Nova Scotia Environment, and I can't comment on the demolition plans that happened at the time. So I can only comment on the chemical data that we're seeing now from the testing we did in 2016.
Okay, all right, so you don't think that's a bad idea?
I'm not going to offer
Do you
an
think it's a
opinion.
good idea for a municipality to give a permit for a dip tank for PQ8 near water where people drink?
So I'm not going to comment on that.
Have you seen the
because
MSDSs on PQ8?
I've seen the MSDS on it, yes.
Okay, so you saw that it says shouldn't be used near potable water or where people live in residential areas?
Yeah, so I'm not going to comment on that, Doris, because I am not responsible for issuing permits,
Okay,
allowing activities to happen on properties.
okay. So the places where and I'm using this word lightly, compost/garbage was buried, there were some places where it was buried 5 foot deep. Now, that compost would probably act as a sponge, I would say, to soak up whatever's down there. So would you say that's good compost? Is that viable compost that you'd put in your garden?
We did not see any compost at the site that deep. The compost we saw was between an inch and about 5 or 6 inches across the surface. At some locations, we saw fill, and the fill contained sawdust and other products that were buried as part of the mill operation.
Okay, so you didn't see where it was 5 foot deep, because I saw it, where there was compost buried 5 foot deep.
No, we did not see any compost that was that
Okay.
deep.
Did you get to see the dip tank pieces that you guys had, or Englobe had dug out of the ground? I have videos of it, of the concrete chunks of where the dip tank was buried into the ground.
So the dip tanks are no longer there. We saw remnant of the concrete dike and the concrete slab that hosted the dip tank.
Have you seen a picture of the dip tank prior to it being gone? Have you seen pictures of any of this stuff?
I did see a picture of the dip tank prior to it being gone, yes.
And you saw the pictures of the other tanks with staining that Environment had issued tickets on, five summary offense tickets back in 2005?
I did not see the summary offense tickets.
Okay, but you know they exist?
No, I did not know they
Okay,
existed.
you know that we were, at the time when the town bought it, there was a Phase 3 ESA going on?
There was, and
Right.
Doris, we're kind of getting away from the chemical quality of what we tested in 2016. So I wasn't involved 10 years ago.
Okay, well, I just want your opinion.
Yeah. And
Your professional opinion?
I don't have an opinion on what happened 10 years ago. Really,
Okay.
the conditions at the site now are the conditions that are there, and those are the conditions that we investigated.
Okay, so, trying to think of how to word this. you're paid by the town, correct?
I have been retained by the town, correct?
Okay. So your allegiance is to them as far as what results you get or whatever?
My allegiance is to the science of what I find and helping the town navigate the Nova Scotia Contaminated Sites Regulation process.
So, okay, well here, let me reword this. So what I read about environmental assessments is once you get to a 3, you always have to go to a 4, 5, and 6 because 3 means they found stuff, they're monitoring it, and wells were put in. So at that point, there's the cleanup, and then there's the phase 6, which is basically you get the clean bill of health. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. You can end the process at any point in that phase.
Okay. So when I went into environment in person and I talked to the gal there, this was when it first hit, when the compost was first dumped and we were just finding out about it. They were unaware of any wells at all. They didn't know anything about any wells put in there, and they had no file. So then I told them there are wells, and I showed them photographs of these yellow rusted dip tank wells. And then magically, a week later, the file was found. But my question is, once you put them in, aren't they supposed to be tested every like 3 to 4 months? That's why they're there, right, to be tested?
At the conclusion of any investigative program, the wells generally are decommissioned, and for whatever reason, those wells were not decommissioned at this site. So Jake
Okay,
Switford
well,
did.
I was told by Heather, I was told by Environment that it was the job of the town to test them once they were put in, and that the town never tested them right after they were put in back in '05. And then when I kind of pointed the finger at Environment saying, why didn't you test them? They test them. They said, no, town was supposed to test them and send them results. So is that how it works?
So again, we're getting off the scope of the environmental investigation that was done in 2016, but there are test results that were conducted on behalf of the town, and they're included in my May 2016 report.
Yeah. Okay. I guess my final question is, if I were to take you to the edge of where the Lake George is, and I were to stick a bottle and scoop up some water right there at Lake George, would you drink it?
From the lake itself?
From the lake, right there where the water's draining in.
We haven't done any testing there, but I can tell you the town has a very robust water sampling program that's part of their process for the water treatment plant. I've looked at those results, and there is nothing of any way, shape, or form that has shown up in the town's testing. So no, I don't expect there's
Okay.
contamination in the lake, and I wouldn't have a problem with it, no.
Okay, so but you know that the town chlorinates the water, which would create the chlorhexamethane. That's what chlorination does. It's going to create some of that stuff that...
In the presence of organic matter, it does, yes.
Well, there's plenty of organic matter there, let me tell you, in the lake, because, everyone, I think, knows about the famous bird poop island, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of organics there. So you add chlorine to that, and there you go.
So the town, as I said, has a very robust mandatory sampling program, and those results are reviewed every time they submit them to Department of Environment. Those chemicals would be part of their package, and if they were detected, the town would have to rectify that.
Right, and the town actually does their own tests, though. It's not like someone else is coming in and testing from away. It's the town's testing their own water and then saying to Environment, here it is, right?
No, the town would put those samples in a bottle and send them to a laboratory for analysis.
Right, but yeah, they're just going to the hospital here.
Not all of them would, no.
So the heavy metals are being tested?
Yes.
Yeah, because I've heard different about that, but anyway, so. Well, I guess that's my only question. That's where I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Good evening, Denise Vacon, property owner in Lake George. Couple quick questions regarding Coliform and E. coli, actually. We have been doing our own citizen testing, sending it up to the lab and monitoring coliform on our own, as well as other pieces on top of some of the testing you've been doing. And the coliform numbers at 2046 continue to escalate. They are now up to 2,400. The E. coli in that well is measuring at a count of 30. Coliform for the first time is appearing in our drilled well at 2054, although the measure is 5, but the drinking water guidelines standards say that should be 0. It's very uncommon for coliform to appear in a drilled well, and we have never had coliform in our well before. Adams is up to 770, and so I would like you to comment on why these numbers continue to escalate. There hasn't been enough water for groundwater contamination to really occur over the last month or even 2. And so can you comment on that, please?
So coliforms, total coliforms, are a natural thing that we see in the environment. If you have a deficiency or a broken dug well, your well is very, very, very susceptible for anything that's draining around it to get into that well. At 2046, the broken well is the input mechanism for all of those coliforms.
Okay, so that's 2046. We have a drilled well. It's now appearing in our well as well. And all of that drainage from the compost site and the sawmill site directly backs and comes down the hill into our property where our wells are located, both at Sheila's and at our place.
I had my well inspected this morning at 8 o'clock by a licensed digger for dug wells. And he can see no problem with the construction, and there has been not enough water to impact that well. Everything tapers away. You told me my well is sitting on the highest point and should not be impacted. So we're here. How does it get there? Or how is it getting there?
And I can't comment on how it's getting into your well, Adam, but I can say coliforms are natural. In the March investigation, we were looking at chemicals, metals, phenols, creosotes. We were looking at physical contaminants that occurred as part of the wood treatment process that could impact the wells.
Now, in most scenarios, they tell you, if you do any research at all on the internet about dug wells, not to put any organic material, fertilizers, anything within 100 feet of your well. They dumped 300 truckloads of organic material 20 feet from my well.
And Sheila's at 2046, and when you tested in March was at 200, and it's now at 2,400. So these numbers are escalating and skyrocketing, and as I've already said, they're appearing in drilled wells, which have not had that occur and typically does not occur in a drilled well.
Yeah, so they can appear in drilled wells, Denise.
They can, but ours haven't, and it hadn't prior to this, other than since the dumping of the compost/garbage and the drainage that comes directly from that property on the slope.
So I can tell you the sampling protocol for coliforms is very stringent, and you can very easily get false results.
2,400 count?
I'm not talking about Sheila's well now.
Okay, but 770 at Adams?
And I'm not talking about Adams. Dug wells are susceptible to coliforms in them.
Right, but the numbers are exceedingly high, and the fact that it is appearing in a drilled well is absolutely even more concerning that something is happening. And now you're saying you're going to stop testing these wells for safety when that material and the drainage off that site is coming directly onto our properties. So I guess what I would recommend is that those wells continue to be tested as the process of this investigation continues, so that the safety of our drinking water can be protected.
So coliforms were never tested as part of the analytical package as a whole in this investigation. We tested 2 isolated locations, one at, bear with me if I get the civic address wrong, 2087, the Nickersons, and they were specifically tested because the town installed a drinking water treatment system, and we did not want to tell the Nickersons their water was safe to drink without actually testing the coliforms.
Which is fine, but the fact of the matter is these numbers continue to escalate. There is a significant amount of compost on the top of the grade that could potentially be causing these numbers to be escalating in the way that they are. And so something needs to be done to monitor and rectify that situation as either until it gets cleaned up or to continue to monitor it so that it can be taken care of.
So
Thank you. Michael Tavares, resident of Yarmouth and a business owner. Thank you for your report. It was very impressive, and I'm looking forward to spending more time with it. I did go and tour the site. I've only been out there a few times in my life, so I have to be honest, I've been here 19 years, but I haven't been a frequent traveler to that part of the municipality. I went to Mr. Gray's property and noticed his surface pond was just black. Is that, and you mentioned there was going to be continual testing on his property. What is in that? What caused that? Because it's pretty awful.
really, that was outside the scope of what we were looking at. In February, we determined that the compost had no chemical contaminants in it. So no metals, no phenols, no creosotes. Sorry, am I too far from the mic? Is that better?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
So we were looking for chemical contaminants in the compost. We didn't see any, and we didn't see any of the indicator parameters that you normally see when you see a problem with a material such as that leaving the site. We saw metals that did not appear to be related to the compost. Given the level of metals impacts we saw and some of the initial history we heard about the site, we suspected that there was a contaminant source on the site other than the compost.
So did you sample that surface pond in his backyard at all? Did you take any, because I understand from conversations that runs down into a stream of some sort, and again, I don't know where it goes. I don't live out there, but as a resident of this town, I'm very concerned for these people's well-being and for the liability placed on the taxpayers of the town with this situation. So was that water ever sampled? And if it was there anything, what did you find in it, if you did?
So after February, we ran a very comprehensive analytical package. We didn't find anything except elevated metals.
Would that have turned it black?
That led us to our investigation in March, where we very specifically looked for elevated metals and chemicals related to wood treatment. So we tested water at the culvert, where it crosses Lake George Road, so up above the pond, and we tested water down below the pond. And we looked for those metals concentrations, and we looked for the phenols and the creosotes, and we didn't see any of that. So that was what our sampling program was looking for. We weren't looking for other things that might explain surface water with colors or algae growth. It wasn't part of our program.
Okay. I just want to make a statement to the council. And I'm probably not going to get on a lot of Christmas card lists in the municipality when I say this, but I think it's got to be said. The water and the quality of drinking water in this town affects every single person who lives here and every single person who lives in the municipality in some way. And I'm glad we have a municipal, the back. I'm glad that he's here. The expense of maintaining this system, the cost associated with watershed protection, the cost associated with what we're dealing with right now with environmental issues is being heavily burdened on the taxpayers of the town. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do all the right things. I believe we absolutely should. But I think we have to talk with our municipal neighbors here at some point in the near future about the relationship that we have and that they have surrounded around the water that supplies the downtown core of the downtown section of our region. This kind of cost of $250,000, very recent costs, and that could grow more when we start removing the debris and all the other stuff that's going to go along with it, is a huge burden on a very small group of taxpayers comparison to the municipalities who have a considerably larger tax-paying community, I think that we've got to really start to think about this kind of municipal burden to protect everyone in our entire region without burdening a small group of people who actually do pay for this service right now. So thank you for what you've done with your work, and I'm looking forward to spending more time with it, and thank you.
I just have one question for you. I'm a resident of Lake George to the south of the property. And I was under the understanding that phenol is foreign to drinking water? Or why is the phenol in my well?
So
Can it just form there?
phenols can be naturally forming.
Okay, because,
Sometimes they are introduced by man-made substances. So we were very concerned that they may have used legacy phenol treatment products on this wood treatment site. And we did a very comprehensive testing program looking for all of those type of products that might be present. We didn't see any of those other products. We only saw a little bit of total phenol. So at the conclusion, we feel that it's a natural
so you
concentration.
don't believe the phenol came from the site
No.
into my well?
I don't know.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
I just got one other question for you. In your report, it refers to the addresses, and of course, when we're reading the addresses, we know which place it is, right? That I have a reverse osmosis in my house, huh? That it was inspected, and that I have a RO system in my house, okay?
I don't recall that I said RO.
And
I believe you said treatment. I said treatment system, but I
That's
could be mistaken.
NOSIS RO system
Okay.
in the report. I don't, okay? It's just,
Okay.
I just got regular softeners or whatnot, okay?
Okay.
I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Any more questions? Do you have a question about the report, Joey? Oh, no, you're good. You're good.
If I may, I just, first of all, thank you for your presentation, and I know it's not easy to sit and be present with all of these challenges. The one thing that's kind of sticking in my brain, which I really have to direct to council more than our engineering friend here, is this rise in coliform that may or may not be related to the dumping on the site and runoff from that. And I don't know exactly what to ask for, but I want to make a note because I'm going to go back to council and just see if there's anything we can do to help support our residents. But would council be willing to track some of these coliform numbers in these residents' wells that are proximal to the runoff related to the dumping? Well, that may be, but for the time being, I'm just addressing it to council here. And I know it's outside the scope of this meeting because this is related to the report, so I'm not even going to demand an answer, just to say that it's a question that's going to be coming in another format because I think that's really making me nervous.
So just,
Jeff, and then you, yeah. You don't have to turn your light off, though, remember.
just for clarification, Councillor Steve, were you asking that we simply track it?
Well, I guess the question was, would council be willing to sort of look at those numbers? Because if we look at the cycle of what happened here, we had the initial report, which really pointed to a deeper challenge related to the chemicals. And I think, for me anyway, took my eye off issues related to the compost or impacts related to the compost and drinking water, because we were focused now on the chemicals and the sawmill. But now what's occurring to me, not that I'm an environmental engineer, but I'm an engineer and a bit of a scientist myself, so it really kind of looks like there might be implications in addition to whatever's there or not there because of the sawmill. We might be starting to see compromised drinking water related specifically to the dumping. And I just would like to get council support to be diligent about looking at that. I know there's not a question there,
Yeah,
but
won't
it'll
get an
come
answer
in
tonight.
another format, okay? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, we're good. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Evan, for all your information. Somebody say wait.
We were supposed to vote on some water for my family, considering I've lost a drilled well that is now...
That's in here tonight.
It's in there for tonight?
Yeah, at the council meeting.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, good. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Council meeting at 7:30.